In just 5 minutes, a powerful white judge who believed he was the law ended up screaming, trembling, and being dragged out of his own courtroom in handcuffs after one black woman refused to kneel before his arrogance. He insulted her, threatened her, ordered her arrest in front of the entire jury, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly opened a single classified file, and within minutes, the FBI stormed in, and the courtroom fell into stunned silence. He thought he was untouchable until the truth tore right through his robe. But what truly shook the nation wasn't just his downfall. It was the question that still haunts every American watching the footage. What exactly was in that file that brought down an entire courthouse in just 5 minutes? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. For nearly 3 decades, Judge Marshall Davis had ruled from the bench like a monarch cloaked in federal robes. Once hailed as a principled jurist with a sharp legal mind, Davis had become something far more dangerous. A man drunk on the illusion of absolute authority. Lately, those whispers had become accusations, especially in cases involving conservatives or allies of former administrations. Davis didn't just issue judgments. He issued punishments, subtle or overt, for anyone even remotely associated with faith-based values, traditional institutions, or nationalist rhetoric. But it wasn't just ideology driving him. It was something darker. Hidden beneath layers of legal formality was a network, a connection to the Liberty Foundation, a shadowy nonprofit masquerading as a philanthropic entity, known in underground circles for laundering political influence behind veils of community work. Few dared speak it aloud, but those who knew, knew. On the surface, the case looked simple. Thomas Sterling, a devout Christian and conservative businessman, had long supported youth programs and disaster relief through his Faith and Family Foundation. Now he was accused of using that very foundation to evade taxes. The evidence was thin, the timing suspicious, and the judge, Marshall Davis, infamous for calling religious conservatives faith-wrapped frauds in a leaked memo. Sterling didn't stand a chance until the DOJ stepped in, not for politics but for justice. They appointed special counsel Jasmine Crockett to ensure a fair trial. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into court like a lawyer. She walked in like a warning. Once a civil rights attorney, now a top legal mind for Congress, she was known for tearing through cover-ups with surgical precision. But this case was different. She wasn't just defending Thomas Sterling. She was challenging a broken system. The Liberty Foundation's shadow loomed over too many rulings, too many sealed files. Jasmine knew Davis wouldn't play fair, but he didn't know. She wasn't here to play. She was here to dismantle. The moment Judge Marshall Davis saw Jasmine Crockett's name on the docket, something in him shifted. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a sneer as he tapped the file with deliberate contempt. "Titles mean nothing in my courtroom," he muttered loud enough for the gallery to hear, his voice like a blade wrapped in velvet. To him, Jasmine wasn't just a lawyer. She was an intruder, a representative of an administration he despised, and worse, a woman known for dismantling the very machinery he used to stay untouchable. His tone dripped with disdain, his eyes sharp with warning. The bailiff glanced up nervously. The room tensed, as if sensing something bigger than a trial was about to begin. And then she walked in. Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom like a gust of controlled fire. Measured, composed, but impossible to ignore. She didn't flinch under the glares or pause at the tension in the air. Her heels clicked with precision, her tailored suit immaculately pressed, her expression unreadable but powerful. She acknowledged the judge with a single respectful nod, then took her place at the defense table like she owned the space, though she knew she didn't. Not yet. Every eye followed her, even those trying not to. Davis's jaw clenched as he watched her open her folder, calm as if she were preparing for a boardroom, not a battle. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a chessboard, and Jasmine Crockett had just made the opening move. Judge Davis watched Jasmine Crockett like a hawk circling prey. His eyes narrowed, calculating, radiating a hostility he didn't bother to hide. His fingers drummed against the bench, slow and deliberate, each tap echoing like a countdown. There was no presumption of fairness in his gaze, Only a quiet fury that someone like her, a government-appointed watchdog with a reputation for exposing corruption, dared to set foot in his courtroom. The gallery sensed it too. The air was dense, waiting to snap. Then Davis leaned forward, his voice low but laced with venom. "I am the law in this courtroom." The words struck like a hammer, not a reminder of order, but a warning, a line drawn in concrete. It wasn't just about authority, it was personal. He wasn't judging a case, he was preparing to crush a challenger. Jasmine said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. She didn't blink. She didn't back down. And in that quiet defiance, a storm began to form. As the murmurs in the gallery settled and the last shuffle of papers faded into silence, Judge Davis adjusted his robe, leaned forward, and spoke with icy authority. "This court is now in session," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber like the closing of a steel door. He didn't look at the jury or the prosecution. His eyes locked straight onto Jasmine Crockett. "Let's begin," he said sharply, less an invitation, more a challenge. The defense attorney had barely made it through the second sentence of his opening when Judge Davis struck like a snake coiled too long. "We're not here for story hour," he said coldly, his voice slicing through the courtroom like broken glass. "Spare me the fairy tales about moral virtue." The attorney paused mid-breath, caught between disbelief and outrage. He had rehearsed this opening meticulously, built it around Thomas Sterling's decades of selfless service, rescuing veterans from homelessness, funding rural education, and pouring millions into disaster relief efforts. But in Davis's courtroom, goodness wasn't just irrelevant, it was an offense. "This isn't a campaign rally or a church bulletin," Davis continued, his lips curled with disdain. "Your client is on trial for tax fraud, not being nominated for sainthood." The gallery went quiet, the tension thick enough to chew. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, but her eyes darkened, studying Davis like a forensic scientist studies blood on concrete. She knew this wasn't just hostility, it was theater, calculated, controlled, and designed to dismantle the defense before it even began. The attorney tried to regain footing, gently pointing out that context was essential to understanding Sterling's financial records. But Davis cut him off again. Faster this time, angrier. "The context," Davis barked, "is that your client is a rich man hiding behind a nonprofit facade." He slammed his gavel once, a hollow, angry sound. "I won't have this courtroom turned into a sermon about so-called values." There was a murmur in the gallery, uncomfortable shifting on the benches, even a raised eyebrow from one of the prosecutors. This wasn't judicial discretion, it was personal vendetta. Jasmine felt it in her bones. Davis wasn't just blocking a line of defense, he was trying to erase an entire narrative, one that didn't fit his agenda, one that might actually point to innocence. The gavel came down again. "Move on," he growled, "or I'll hold you in contempt." Jasmine knew then what she had suspected all along. This was not going to be a fair trial. Not with Davis on the bench, not with Sterling's record being treated like contraband, and certainly not when truth itself had become a threat to power. She leaned forward, calm but sharp, the folder of documents beneath her fingertips humming with potential energy. If Davis wanted a fight, he'd get one, but not the kind he expected, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to plead for fairness. She was here to expose the system and burn it down if she had to. Jasmine rose deliberately, calm but firm, the weight of her words carried by quiet precision. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing with respectful confidence, "I'd like to submit verified records from the Office of White House Counsel, which provide—" Her sentence never reached its destination. Judge Davis slammed his gavel down with a force that silenced the room and echoed like a gunshot. "Save it," he barked, eyes narrowing with open contempt. "I know exactly what this is. Another conservative stunt dressed up as public service. A feel-good fairy tale to distract from financial misconduct." His words weren't rulings. They were accusations, delivered with venom, without evidence. "These so-called foundations always hide behind the flag in Scripture," he continued, voice rising, "but I see right through them." The gallery stiffened. Even the court reporter paused, unsure whether to record what sounded more like a personal tirade than judicial commentary. Jasmine stood her ground, hands at her sides, her posture unshaken. But inside she could feel the courtroom tipping. She wasn't just facing bias. She was standing in the blast zone of a judge who had already decided the ending. And in this rigged game, even the truth needed permission to speak. Every time Jasmine attempted to mention the Faith and Family Foundation, Judge Davis cut her off with ruthless precision, his gavel crashing down like a war drum, each strike louder, more erratic, more theatrical than the last. Irrelevant, he barked, not even bothering to let her finish her sentence. We're not here to praise charities. We're here to expose fraud. The words dripped with contempt, not just for Sterling, but for everything the foundation represented: faith, family, and a worldview Davis clearly despised. When Jasmine pivoted, trying to reference the internal meetings Sterling held with board members, meetings that directly tied into the timeline of the alleged tax discrepancies, Davis was already mid-interruption. Those discussions are inadmissible, he snapped, leaning forward with eyes blazing. I won't have this courtroom turned into a pulpit for ideological distraction. The courtroom shifted, a collective tightening of posture, as the gallery realized what was happening. A judge wasn't suppressing misconduct, he was suppressing the defense. Jasmine stayed steady, but her breath slowed, deepened as she recalibrated under fire. The documents she'd spent weeks preparing, reviewed by government counsel, had suddenly become untouchable, not by law but by decree. Davis wasn't objecting. He was rewriting the rules on the fly, weaponizing his robe to silence context, connection, and clarity. One juror furrowed his brow, glancing sideways at another, confusion blooming like a bruise across the panel. They were supposed to weigh the facts, but what facts? Every door Jasmine tried to open was slammed shut before it could creak. Her voice, though calm, was becoming sharper, more deliberate with each attempt. Measured but resolute. And Davis, he wasn't just dismissing evidence. He was making it disappear. The courtroom had already begun to buckle under the weight of tension. Biased rulings, silenced objections, and evidence dismissed before it was even heard. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come for permission. She'd come for the truth. And now, as the atmosphere thickened with something that felt more like war than justice, she opened the binder that would shatter the illusion of control Judge Davis thought he still had. Jasmine didn't rush. Her hands moved with the deliberateness of a surgeon about to make the first incision, precise, intentional, and fully aware of the damage it might uncover. The binder she placed on the evidence table was thick, over 200 pages deep, every document numbered, indexed, cross-referenced. It wasn't theater, it was structure, truth with footnotes. Your Honor, she began, her tone steady as steel. This material was submitted during the discovery phase under Rule 26.2 and Rule 34, logged by the court clerk's office and made available to the prosecution and to this bench. She slid a copy of the time-stamped receipt toward Davis, dated, verified, and acknowledged. The paper made a soft sliding sound against the polished oak, but the message landed like thunder. She turned to the jury, never raising her voice, but allowing them to see every highlighted section, every signature, every data point that proved the defense had played by the rules. Davis, she knew, would hate that more than anything. She moved to the display screen and clicked to the next slide. What appeared was a neatly organized timeline. 3 court rulings, all issued by Davis, all involving politically sensitive cases tied to conservative donors or faith-based groups. Then side by side, she revealed the bank records. Each wire transfer from the Liberty Foundation, each sent within 48 hours of those rulings. The dates matched like a mirror. Jasmine didn't need to say anything dramatic. The evidence spoke for itself, but she added just enough to make the picture undeniable. The account receiving these funds, she said, is a Cayman-based entity registered to an individual named Marshall D. Davis. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One juror stiffened. Another leaned forward. Even the prosecution shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't an accusation. It was a correlation, precise and damning. Jasmine turned the page. Further documentation confirms these funds came from donor pools tied to legal outcomes in this very courtroom. she continued, her voice unwavering. This is not circumstantial. This is a pattern. She looked back to Davis, now visibly rattled. His jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck pulsed. His hand hovered above the gavel, unsure whether to reach for it or throw it. Then he snapped. Those documents are not admissible, he screamed, slamming the gavel down with such force it echoed like a gunshot through the marble walls. This is a deliberate attempt to manipulate this court, to discredit its authority. His face was red, sweating, the robe around his neck suddenly looking too tight, like it was strangling him from within. You're out of line, Counselor Crockett. This is judicial sabotage. He wasn't speaking like a judge anymore. He was yelling like a man whose mask had slipped, a man whose secrets were being peeled back layer by layer. Jasmine stood still, spine straight, hands calmly folded over the binder. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout back. When she spoke, her voice was cool, clear, and unshakably anchored in the law. Your Honor, I have followed every protocol laid out by this court and by federal discovery standards, she said evenly. These documents were lawfully obtained, properly submitted, and directly relevant to the integrity of this trial. She didn't blink. If the truth threatens the stability of this courtroom, then I suggest we consider what that says about the stability itself. Davis's fingers trembled against the bench. He looked at her like he was staring down a force he couldn't control. The jury remained frozen. Not a sound, not a breath. The room was no longer just watching a trial. It was watching a collapse. A structure once built to uphold justice now cracked at its foundation. And Jasmine Crockett, alone and unafraid, stood at the epicenter, not with fury, but with facts. Not with noise, but with undeniable, unflinching proof. Because in a courtroom drowning in noise, the truth doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be heard. The evidence was no longer a theory. It was a pattern, printed, verified, and displayed for all to see. The courtroom, once under Davis's iron grip, now hung in suspended disbelief. Every corner of the chamber felt the tremor of a truth too dangerous to contain. But instead of confronting the facts, Judge Davis did what desperate men often do when power slips through their fingers. He lashed out, not with law, but with fury, not to preserve justice, but to silence it. Judge Davis rose from his bench so violently that his chair scraped against the wall with a sharp screech, interrupting even the quiet shuffle of the bailiff's boots. His face, once pale with composure, had turned a furious shade of crimson, veins pulsing along his temple like fault lines about to split. His voice thundered through the courtroom with a rage so raw it seemed to shake the marble columns. This is an abomination of process, he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Jasmine. You, Counselor Crockett, have insulted the authority of this court, compromised the sanctity of these proceedings, and manipulated this forum for your own agenda. He reached for his gavel but didn't strike it. He clutched it, white-knuckled, as if it were the last symbol of power he still controlled. The silence in the room cracked like glass under pressure. Jasmine said nothing. Her breathing remained even, her posture unbroken, though every word hurled at her was meant to knock her off center. Davis's tone escalated, abandoning judicial decorum altogether. You are officially held in contempt of court, he roared, the words sharp enough to cut flesh. Effective immediately, for the crime of interfering with the lawful administration of justice. He slammed the gavel down with a violence that startled even the jury, who flinched collectively at the sound. But the declaration wasn't about law. It was a threat wrapped in robes, a weapon wielded by a man who feared what had just been exposed. The court officers hesitated. Even they could sense something had changed. This wasn't a simple disciplinary measure. This was an abuse of process unfolding in real time. One bailiff glanced toward the prosecution table, unsure whether to act or wait. The prosecutor looked down, silent, no longer defending the judge with glances or gestures. Davis's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass and missed. His eyes locked on Jasmine like she was a fire he couldn't contain. You've crossed a line, he hissed, voice hoarse now, the courtroom no longer echoing with dominance but unraveling into chaos. This isn't advocacy, it's sabotage. And yet Jasmine remained rooted, her chin high, gaze unwavering. She spoke not in anger, but with surgical clarity. "Your Honor," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "I have submitted lawful documents, followed every procedural rule, and exercised the rights afforded to me under federal code." Her voice didn't tremble. It resonated. "Your declaration of contempt isn't based on misconduct. It's based on fear. Fear of what the truth reveals." The words didn't shout. They pierced. She wasn't challenging the law. She was defending it. And in that moment, the courtroom understood. This wasn't about order. It was about control. And Davis had just shown the entire world how far he'd go to keep it. Judge Davis rose to his feet with the force of a man used to instant obedience. His hand slammed the bench, not with the precision of authority, but with the desperation of a cornered animal. His voice tore through the room, raw and cracking. "Officers, arrest her, now!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Jasmine. "She is in contempt. She is undermining this court, and I will not tolerate insubordination in my presence." The courtroom flinched, but no one moved. Not the jury, not the prosecution, not even the officers tasked with carrying out his command. The bailiff closest to the bench looked toward the others, his eyes filled with doubt. A second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing from Jasmine to the trembling judge, then back again. For a moment, the room became a portrait of hesitation, frozen between law and conscience, between command and moral clarity. Jasmine remained completely still. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't so much as blink. Her hands rested on the binder like it was a ledger of truth, not just evidence. She stood not like a criminal, but like a witness, a symbol, a challenge to every unchecked abuse that had passed through that courtroom under the guise of justice. "What are you waiting for?" Davis shouted, voice splintering as his hands slammed the bench again. "I gave you an order." But his voice no longer rang with authority. It cracked, brittle and exposed, the sound of a man who had finally discovered that a title alone could no longer bend the world around him. The courtroom officers stood frozen, as if his command had triggered something deeper than protocol, a reckoning. One officer took a half step forward, then stopped. Another shook his head, almost imperceptibly. The lead bailiff, an older man with 2 decades of courtroom duty in his eyes, looked at Davis, then at Jasmine, and did nothing. It wasn't defiance for the sake of pride. It was refusal rooted in something far more dangerous to corruption: conscience. They knew what they had just witnessed. They knew what was in those documents. And they knew, perhaps for the first time, that enforcing the judge's order wouldn't uphold justice. It would bury it. Jasmine didn't need to say a word. Her calm presence was an indictment more powerful than any statute. And now, with the entire courtroom watching, the system itself was hesitating, not because it was confused, but because it had finally started to remember what justice was supposed to feel like. Judge Davis's voice erupted again, this time louder, harsher, laced with the panic of a man watching his authority evaporate before his eyes. "You'll be held accountable too," he shouted, his finger now jabbing wildly at the court officers. "Any officer who disobeys this order will be charged with insubordination. You hear me? You'll face disciplinary action, suspension, criminal charges if I have to." His words echoed off the marble like a threat fired into a void, but no one moved. The courtroom was no longer under his control, and that terrified him. His threats grew more frantic, each one louder than the last, trying to reassert dominance by sheer volume. "You think you can ignore me? I am a federal judge. You answer to this bench, not to her," he screamed, his face flushed, spit catching the edge of his lip, his robe clinging to his shoulders like a mantle that no longer fit. The court officers stood frozen, not from confusion, but from clarity. They weren't hesitating because they didn't understand the order. They were hesitating because they finally did. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett remained a silent pillar, her stillness louder than his shouting, her presence calm, unshakable, and immovable. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. This wasn't just a breakdown in courtroom protocol. It was a reckoning, and every man in uniform now had to choose: obey the voice of panic or honor the oath they had sworn to justice. Jasmine didn't flinch beneath the judge's threats. She didn't raise her voice. She simply reached down, unfastened the latches of her leather case, and pulled out a thin, neatly stapled file. The room watched in suspended silence as she opened it with the care of someone handling something explosive. Her eyes never left Davis. "Before you take another step," she said, her voice calm but laced with iron, "I strongly suggest you review the transfer records from the Liberty Foundation, specifically the ones bearing your signature of authorization." The words dropped like a blade across the room. No anger, no performance, just precision sharpened by truth. She stepped forward and placed the file on the evidence table, flipping it open to the first page. A wire transfer form, dated, authenticated, and signed in looping ink, Marshall D. Davis. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as jurors leaned in and officers froze mid-breath. Jasmine tapped the document once, firmly. "That one was processed 42 hours before your ruling on the Everett case," and she added, "There are 3 more just like it." And in that instant, the power in the room shifted, not with a bang, but with quiet, crushing certainty. Jasmine didn't just present the evidence. She unveiled it like a series of surgical strikes, each more devastating than the last. With a steady hand, she tapped the courtroom monitor, and the screen lit up with the first document, a scan of an official court record, its top corner clearly marked with the seal of the Federal Judicial Council. The title read, "Internal Memorandum. Meeting Minutes, March 15th. Faith and Family Foundation Litigation Review." At the bottom, in heavy ink, was the word "sealed," followed by the initials JD. "This document," Jasmine said, voice level but cutting, "is the transcript of a private judicial meeting that took place behind closed doors, just days before this trial was set in motion. It was sealed without procedural justification, no review, no transparency, no oversight." She paused, allowing the silence to settle like a suffocating weight. "And the judge who sealed it is the same one presiding over this case." Before anyone could respond, she moved to the next exhibit with the click of a remote. The screen shifted to a full-color financial statement pulled from a foreign banking institution. Jasmine zoomed in until the details were unmistakable. Account holder, Marshall D. Davis. Institution, First National Bank of Grand Cayman. Transfer source, Liberty Foundation, Cayman Holdings Limited. "This wire," Jasmine continued, "was processed 48 hours after the March 15th meeting. Amount, $150,000. Destination, the very account you see here." She circled the transaction with a laser pointer, the red dot shaking slightly, not from her hands but from the tremor rippling through the room. One juror's mouth fell open. The prosecution sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the screen as if it were a slow-motion car crash. "This was not a coincidence," Jasmine said. "This was coordination." But she wasn't finished. "Let's talk about destruction of evidence," she added, her voice dipping into something colder, quieter, deadlier. A moment later, the monitor went black, only to flash back on with grainy security footage. The timestamp read 12:37 a.m. The location tag, Judicial Chambers, West Hall, District 9. The footage showed a tall figure in black robes entering the room alone, looking around nervously before approaching a locked cabinet. The gallery gasped. Jasmine let the video play for a few more seconds before freezing it at the exact frame where the figure, unmistakably Judge Davis, was caught feeding a stack of documents into a small burn canister. The light from the flame lit his face just enough for the jury to see what he likely never meant for anyone to witness. "This footage," Jasmine said quietly, "was recovered from the chamber's backup camera, the one not listed on the court's official layout. It was accessed under warrant by internal investigators from the Office of Inspector General." Gasps turned to silence. A few jurors looked visibly sick. One court officer took a step back, as if physically repelled by the screen. Davis sat stiffly behind the bench, lips pressed into a line, eyes twitching but unmoving, like a man watching the walls of his fortress begin to fall, stone by stone. Jasmine turned off the video. The silence returned, but now it was thick with revelation, not suspense. "We now have," she continued, eyes never leaving the judge, "a sealed meeting that violated judicial transparency, a confirmed offshore transaction that raises serious conflict of interest and direct visual evidence of document destruction by the very hand meant to protect this court's integrity. Her final words rang with clarity, not shouted, but delivered like a final verdict. What we are witnessing is not just bias. It is obstruction, not just corruption, but betrayal of the oath, of the robe, and of every citizen who believes in the law. She let the words settle, then stepped back slowly, leaving the screen black, the evidence glowing like embers in every juror's mind. The courtroom didn't just fall silent, it stopped breathing. Judge Davis hadn't said a word since the video began, because deep down he knew the law hadn't turned on him. The truth had. The silence following Jasmine's final exhibit was unbearable. Thick, suffocating, electrified with the weight of too many truths suddenly laid bare. But then, from the corner of the room, came a sound no one expected. A sharp, choked breath. Then another. Heads turned. Eyes searched. And then the sound cracked into a sob, raw and uncontrollable, from behind the elevated clerk's station. All eyes locked onto her. Anna Feldman, the court's junior clerk. Barely 30, known for her precision, her silence, her unshakable professionalism. But now she was shaking, violently, visibly, her face blotched with red, her hand pressed to her mouth like she was trying to keep a dam from breaking. She stood up slowly as if pulled by something stronger than willpower. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "He made me do it," she said, then louder, firmer. "He made me delete the files." The courtroom snapped into attention. Jasmine didn't move. The judge didn't breathe. Anna clutched the edge of her desk, like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. "The night before the pre-trial hearing," she continued, voice shaking but unstoppable, "Judge Davis called me into chambers, said there were sensitive documents that had to disappear, internal memos, notes from the March 15th meeting. He said they weren't relevant, said it was court housekeeping." Her eyes welled with tears, but she didn't stop. "I asked if we should log the changes. He looked at me and said, 'Do you want to work here next week, Anna?'" Gasps echoed across the gallery. One juror covered their mouth. Another scribbled frantically into their notepad. Anna's hands trembled as she wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve. "I didn't know what to do," she sobbed. "He told me no one would believe a clerk over a federal judge." Then she reached down and lifted a USB drive from her drawer, holding it out in the open like an offering to a god she once feared. "I saved a backup," she whispered. "I was scared, but I couldn't delete everything." She looked at Jasmine, then at the court officers, her voice quivering but clear. "It's all there. The deleted files, the metadata, even the folder names. Everything he told me to erase." The courtroom felt like it tilted. Davis went ghost white, his lips parting but no sound emerging. For the first time, his power didn't just crack, it collapsed. Jasmine stepped forward slowly, took the USB with both hands and nodded once. Solemn, silent, the weight of 1,000 buried truths now rising from the grave. The gallery didn't dare speak, because in that moment, it wasn't Jasmine who delivered the final blow. It was the voice of someone the system thought too small to matter. And now her truth filled the room like thunder. Judge Davis was no longer speaking. He was unraveling, collapsing beneath the weight of everything he could no longer deny. His voice rose, cracked, and broke like a dam that had held back years of entitlement and corruption. "You're nothing but a political puppet," he screamed across the courtroom, spit flying from his lips, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "You were sent here by the White House to humiliate me. This whole circus, it's a setup, a smear campaign orchestrated by bureaucrats and media snakes who want to control this bench." His finger jabbed at Jasmine like it was the only weapon he had left, trembling as if barely connected to reason. "You're not a lawyer. You're an operative, a pawn in some deep state charade." He was pacing now, stumbling behind the bench as though the floor itself betrayed him. His robe, once a symbol of solemn authority, now looked like a costume draped over a man exposed. "You think bringing in some junior clerk and a few bank records is going to erase decades of rulings? You think your little flash drive means anything?" His tone twisted into a deranged sneer. "You're part of the machine. You're not here for justice. You're here for vengeance. Every word hit the walls like punches, but the courtroom remained frozen, watching as the last fragments of his authority crumbled into dust. Jasmine stood still, her face unreadable. No fear, no retaliation, only silence that rang louder than his hysteria. "This is all scripted," Davis shouted, his voice fraying at the edges. "They planned this. The media, the politicians, your handlers. They fed you this whole performance." He turned to the gallery, arms outstretched as if pleading for an invisible jury to believe him. "She's a fraud in a tailored suit." But the room had already made up its mind. No one answered. No one defended him. The courtroom didn't just see a man protesting his innocence. They saw a man cornered by the very truth he tried to silence. And the harder he shouted, the more alone he became. Just as Judge Davis's tirade reached its most feverish crescendo, his words unraveling into half-formed accusations, arms flailing in a desperate attempt to reclaim control, the sound of the courtroom doors slamming open reverberated like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Silence fell instantly. 4 men in dark navy suits entered with deliberate, purposeful strides, their badges gleaming under the harsh courtroom lights. They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for permission. The lead agent, tall, calm, and unmistakably authoritative, raised a black leather folio and spoke with chilling clarity. "This courtroom is now under federal investigation, effective immediately." His voice was not loud, but it carried with the unmistakable weight of finality, like a verdict no appeal could touch. The room didn't gasp. It froze. It was the silence that came not from surprise, but from the sudden collapse of a long-standing illusion. Judge Davis's mouth fell open, but no words came. He stumbled backward, knocking over a glass of water that shattered against the bench and sprayed across his notes. "No," he muttered, voice hollow, disbelieving. "No, this is wrong. This is illegal. You can't just walk in here like this." But the agents were already fanning out, 2 of them positioning themselves near the exits, the others slowly approaching the bench with procedural calm. "This is a coordinated smear," Davis shouted now, sweat running down his temple. "This is political theater, fabricated by people who want to destroy my career." He turned, pointing wildly at Jasmine. "She's part of it. She was sent by the administration. This is all orchestrated." The lead agent didn't flinch. He simply reached into his coat, pulled out a sealed warrant, and placed it firmly on the bench in front of Davis. "Judge Marshall Davis," he said with icy precision, "you are the subject of an active investigation into obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, and conspiracy to suppress evidence." Davis stared at the document as if it were written in another language. "I want my lawyer," he finally choked, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. "I want my lawyer now." But no one rushed to his aid. No one stood up. The very people who once bowed to his authority now looked away, some with shame, others with something colder, relief. Because in that moment, Davis was no longer a judge. He was just a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Judge Davis stood behind the bench like a man caught in a spotlight he'd spent years avoiding. His once commanding presence had shriveled into something fragile. His robe now clung to him like a weight instead of a symbol. His hands trembled at his sides, and his mouth hung slightly open, searching for words that would not come. The warrant lay on the bench in front of him, untouched, glowing like a final verdict. The agents didn't need to move forward yet. The silence in the room was its own kind of execution. And in the midst of it, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, not triumphantly, not with vengeance, but with the steadiness of someone who had carried the truth alone for too long and now finally had air to breathe. Her voice broke the silence, not loud but unmistakably final. "No," she said, and the single word stopped Davis cold. He looked at her like a man facing his own reflection for the first time. "This isn't a conspiracy. This isn't political revenge. And it's not an ambush." She took one more step forward, her gaze locked on his with quiet force. "This is justice, plain and undeniable." Every syllable hit like stone, not thrown in anger, but laid like bricks, rebuilding a system he had spent years tearing down. "You did this to yourself, Your Honor," she continued. You wrote your downfall with every biased ruling, every sealed file, every truth you buried to protect your image. Her voice didn't rise, but its clarity cut through the room like glass. You weren't sabotaged. You weren't framed. You were warned. Again and again. Davis swallowed hard, but still said nothing. He seemed smaller now, his shoulders hunched, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. You abused your power, Jasmine said, her words now carrying the gravity of an entire courtroom silence. You believed the robe made you untouchable, that the bench would shield you from consequences. But justice, she paused, eyes sweeping the room, was never yours to bend. It belongs to the people, and they've been watching. The agents exchanged a glance but didn't interrupt. No one did. Even the jury sat frozen, eyes wide, jaws tight. Jasmine turned back to Davis one last time. This didn't happen because someone came after you. It happened because you stopped believing you were accountable to anyone. Then she said it, not like a declaration, but like a closing line carved into stone. You destroyed yourself, Judge Davis, with your arrogance, your corruption, and your contempt for the law. All we did was hold up the mirror. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It didn't need to. Because the silence that followed was the sound of justice finally landing where it belonged. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut around Judge Davis's wrist cut through the courtroom like a blade. Final, cold, metallic. It was a sound no one expected to hear in this room, least of all from the bench. For years, his gavel had been the final word, his rulings treated like scripture, his authority unchallenged. Now he stood hunched between two federal agents, his once commanding hands pulled behind his back, and restrained like any other defendant he had ever sentenced with disdain. The same man who had towered over attorneys, dismissed evidence with a wave, and silenced truth with a gavel now stood exposed. No robe, no shield, no command in his voice. His lips were pressed into a tight, colorless line, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting but unable to lock onto anyone else's. He looked not like a man surprised by injustice, but one crushed by his own reflection. The agents didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their movements were measured, almost clinical, as if they knew the symbolism of every step they took. One gently guided Davis forward by the elbow, while the other followed close behind. He stumbled once on the courtroom steps, those same steps he had once descended to lecture young attorneys, to pose for press photos, to shake hands with donors. The gallery watched in total silence, not out of respect, but stunned disbelief. Some turned away, others stared unblinking, as if imprinting the image into memory. No one smiled. This wasn't victory, this was reckoning. And Jasmine, standing at her table, didn't move or gloat. She simply watched with steady eyes, the calm presence of someone who had fought the long, quiet battle and let the truth do the final speaking. As Davis passed by the jury box, he kept his gaze down. He didn't dare look up, not at the jurors who had once followed his instructions, not at the clerk whose voice had shattered his defense, not at the citizens who once believed the black robe stood for impartiality. His walk was slow, burdened not by the agents at his side, but by the collapse of an empire he had built on fear, arrogance, and unchecked control. The courtroom doors opened once more, this time not for his entrance, but his exit. And in that moment, the title, Your Honor, became a distant echo. He wasn't escorted out like a judge. He was led out like a man stripped bare by his own crimes, his legacy dragging behind him like a broken chain. The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud, and for the first time in years, the courtroom felt like a place where justice had finally walked taller than the man behind the bench. The arrest of Judge Davis sent a tremor through the American judiciary, but what followed was nothing short of an earthquake. Within hours of the courtroom's explosive revelations, federal task forces began executing sealed warrants in multiple districts across the country. What had once seemed like isolated misconduct was now being revealed as the tip of a sprawling, meticulously concealed network. The Liberty Foundation, long paraded as a philanthropic powerhouse dedicated to faith and family, was unmasked as the central artery of judicial corruption, funneling dark money, laundering influence, and manipulating case outcomes across state lines. Investigators traced donations back through layers of shell corporations, political action committees, and dummy charities. The pattern was unmistakable. Conservative-aligned plaintiffs receiving favorable rulings from judges whose campaign funds, travel expenses, and even mortgages had been quietly padded by Liberty-linked accounts. Subpoenas hit federal courthouses in Dallas, Atlanta, Cincinnati, and Phoenix. One judge was caught trying to shred documents in his garage. Another resigned overnight and vanished before agents could reach his estate. Internal memos, recovered from seized email servers, revealed coordinated language between supposedly independent rulings, identical phrasing, timelines, and even file redactions that could not have been coincidence. Whispered rumors of protected meetings at luxury retreats in the Caribbean now became central pieces of evidence, with flight manifests and hotel records connecting names that had long been protected by political and legal insulation. Public confidence plummeted as footage emerged of high-ranking judges escorted from their chambers in cuffs. Courthouse flagpoles stood half-mast. News anchors spoke with uncharacteristic gravity, their voices tight with the realization that the guardians of law had become its greatest betrayers. The Department of Justice, under extraordinary pressure, announced the formation of a Judicial Integrity Task Force, a sweeping probe with no jurisdictional limits and no tolerance for obstruction. Judges once feared and revered now found themselves under the very microscope they had once wielded without question. This wasn't reform, it was reckoning. And through it all, one name kept surfacing in the original investigative trail. Liberty Foundation. The same foundation that had bought silence, shaped verdicts, and hollowed out trust from within. What began with Jasmine Crockett's calm voice in a single courtroom had now grown into a national confrontation with a system that had rotted behind closed doors. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about ideology. It was about power unchecked, and justice finally, at last, refusing to look away. It didn't end with a dramatic scene or a media frenzy. It ended with a sentence, a simple, powerful declaration that carried more weight than months of accusations and televised hearings. When the newly appointed federal magistrate entered the courtroom, there was no fanfare, only a focused, meticulous calm. He had reviewed thousands of pages of filings, including evidence that had been unlawfully withheld, testimonies that had been silenced, and internal communications that pointed to judicial tampering at the highest level. And when he finally spoke, his voice was clear, steady, and merciless in its precision. In light of overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, systemic suppression of exculpatory materials, incredible proof of politically motivated prosecution, this court dismisses all charges against Thomas Sterling with prejudice. This case should never have been brought to trial. The words struck not like a verdict, but like an exoneration carved into stone. Thomas Sterling, seated beside Jasmine at the defense table, closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in a kind of quiet devastation, the release of a man who had been buried alive by accusation and had finally been allowed to breathe. For months, his name had been dragged through headlines, his legacy twisted, his foundation, a lifeline to countless families, dismissed as a tax shelter. He had been paraded as a symbol of elite corruption, when in fact, he was its victim. He didn't weep. He didn't smile. He simply reached for Jasmine's hand and gave it a quiet, grateful squeeze. Around them, the gallery began to stir, not with cheers, but with slow, stunned acknowledgement, as if everyone present was still recalibrating the definition of justice. The prosecution, now stripped of its star witness and stained by the fallout from Judge Davis's exposure, offered no rebuttal, no appeal. Their silence was as loud as the truth Jasmine had spent weeks dragging into the light. And it was Jasmine who remained composed as ever, collecting her files with care, as though this too was just one battle in a war she never expected to be fair, but refused to let be forgotten. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse were met not with a press conference, but with Sterling's quiet statement, "I forgive, but I do not forget. I walk free today because someone had the courage to stand between me and a system that lost its compass." In the days that followed, the Faith and Family Foundation saw its reputation restored, donations returned, and partnerships rekindled. But more than the rebuilding of an institution, what truly resonated was the vindication of a man who had once sat alone at the center of a storm. And while the courtroom had returned to stillness, the echoes of the decision reached far beyond its walls, into other trials, other judges, and a nation forced to reckon with the quiet, painful reality that sometimes the innocent aren't saved by the system, but in spite of it. In the wake of Judge Davis's collapse, America didn't just react, it awakened. The courtroom spectacle hadn't merely exposed one man's corruption. It had shattered the illusion that justice was immune to decay. Across the country, ordinary people, teachers, mechanics, veterans, single mothers, sat with furrowed brows and whispered the same chilling question over and over. If he could do it, how many others already have? For the first time in decades, the myth of judicial infallibility was cracking. It wasn't just about Davis anymore. It was about every rushed conviction, every ignored appeal, every overruled objection that once seemed unfortunate, but now felt deliberate. In barber shops and church basements, coffee shops and bus stops, people didn't just talk about the courtroom, they talked about their courtroom, the one where their cousin got railroaded, the one where their mother's lawsuit vanished, the one where they'd been told, that's just how the system works. Civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Innocence Project tripled their intake overnight. Volunteer lawyers, legal interns, and retired investigators poured into dusty archives, demanding access to sealed files, subpoenaed phone logs, and audio from courtrooms long closed. Databases of old rulings were combed through line by line, cross-referenced with campaign donations, vacation records, even real estate purchases. Patterns began to emerge, eerily similar to Davis's. Last-minute evidentiary exclusions, sealed motions with no oversight, defendants linked to specific political or religious identities punished with extraordinary severity. In Chicago, a woman's 17-year-old conviction for tax fraud was re-examined after it was discovered her judge had received speaking fees from a foundation tied to her accuser. In Alabama, a death row case was reopened when files showed the presiding judge had denied DNA testing without explanation. The floodgates weren't just opening, they were breaking wide apart. The legal establishment tried to contain the wave, calling it an overcorrection, a media-fueled witch hunt. But those words no longer had power. The public had seen too much. They had heard Davis scream about conspiracies, watched a federal judge beg for a lawyer as the walls closed in. They had seen a clerk cry as she admitted to being forced to destroy records. Those weren't scripts. They were truths. Raw, undeniable, permanent, and now the system was being forced to answer for more than one man. It was being asked, how long have you known? How far does this go? And how many innocent people paid the price while you looked the other way? For the first time in a generation, America wasn't just asking whether justice had failed. It was asking who justice had been working for all along. The collapse of Judge Davis wasn't just a personal disgrace. It was a national rupture, one that cracked open decades of blind faith in black robes and bench gavels. As news of the scandal ricocheted across the country, the response wasn't just emotional, it was seismic. The judiciary, once the most trusted branch of government, found itself under a microscope it had long evaded. A comprehensive Gallup poll revealed that confidence in federal courts fell from 67% to just 26% in under 2 weeks. Even more alarming was what lay beneath the numbers. Over half of those surveyed believed judicial decisions are influenced more by politics and personal interest than by law. For a nation built on the ideal of equal justice, that wasn't a crack in the foundation, it was structural collapse. The shockwaves reached every corner of the legal world. Law school deans issued urgent memoranda to students and faculty, some describing the moment as a generational turning point for legal ethics and accountability. In televised roundtables and academic symposiums, veteran scholars didn't hide their concern. Dr. Meredith Hall, a constitutional historian from Columbia University, warned, "What Davis revealed is not the exception. It's the result of decades of unchecked deference. Justice, in its purest form, can only thrive in full daylight, but for years we've let too much of it happen in the shadows. Her words were printed in bold across the New York Times Sunday Review, later quoted by senators in a special Judiciary Committee hearing investigating judicial conduct standards. The public, once taught to view the judiciary as above reproach, began to reinterpret what fairness meant. Grassroots campaigns erupted nationwide, demanding access to sealed court records, recordings of trials, and public oversight of judicial appointments. Hashtags like Years Eyes on the Bench and Yours Justice in Daylight trended for weeks. Legal nonprofits launched hotlines for whistleblowers inside courthouses, and within days reports poured in. Claims of secret meetings, evidence suppression, judge-prosecutor collusion, even casual bigotry behind closed doors. Suddenly, things people had once whispered about the legal system, stories passed down in neighborhoods, told quietly by defeated defendants, were being taken seriously. The press didn't dismiss them anymore. Lawmakers couldn't ignore them. The public wouldn't forget them. And through it all, the narrative kept circling back to the same truth Jasmine Crockett had exposed in that blistering courtroom reckoning. Judges are not gods. Courtrooms are not sanctuaries. And justice is not self-regulating. It survives only where it is scrutinized, preserved only where it is pressured, and trusted only when it is earned. For generations, Americans were taught to believe the law would always do the right thing. After Davis, that belief didn't just fracture, it evolved. Justice would no longer be presumed. It would have to prove itself every single day in the light. The congressional hearing room felt less like a chamber of inquiry and more like a reckoning in progress. Every seat was filled, not just by lawmakers and staffers, but by a public that had grown tired of watching justice operate behind closed doors. The Davis scandal hadn't just shocked the system, it had ruptured something deeper, the belief that the judicial branch was immune to corruption. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled. The air was thick with the tension of long overdue accountability. Then, as if cutting through the fog, Professor Lena Moreau, one of the nation's most respected constitutional scholars, stepped up to the microphone and delivered a statement that would redefine the moment. "We have built our courthouses like cathedrals," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. Stone columns, elevated benches, ceremonial language, all meant to inspire awe. And that awe has worked too well, because somewhere along the way, we stopped questioning what happened inside them. Senators leaned forward. No one interrupted. We surround our judges with protocol and deference. We grant them lifelong tenure, and we treat their rulings as divine. But let me be clear, when a space becomes untouchable, it becomes dangerous. And when a person becomes unaccountable, they become unstoppable. That's not democracy, that's a monarchy in disguise. She flipped a page in her notes and looked directly into the eyes of the Senate panel. Judge Davis was not the system failing. He was the system functioning exactly as it was allowed to. His power came not just from his gavel, but from our silence. Her words hit like hammers. One senator glanced down at his notes, visibly shaken. Another crossed his arms tighter across his chest. Moreau continued, "Justice must be respected, yes, but it must never be revered to the point of immunity, because what we revere, we stop questioning. And what we stop questioning learns how to get away with anything." Outside the chamber, protest signs echoed her words. Inside, her quote was entered into the official record and would go on to headline editorials across the country. "We didn't just allow unchecked power," she said in her closing. "We enshrined it. We wrote it into stone. We taught generations to bow to it. And if we don't unwrite that now, if we don't tear down the myth of the untouchable courtroom, then Davis won't be the last. He'll be the blueprint." The silence that followed wasn't routine. It wasn't procedural. It was the kind of silence that precedes change. The collective inhaling of a system realizing, perhaps for the first time, that even justice must be held accountable, or it will become something else entirely. The room had heard testimonies before, of broken lives, of corrupted systems, of the slow suffocation that comes when justice bends to power. But what Mariah Steele delivered that day was something different. It was not just a plea, it was an indictment. Her words echoed with the urgency of someone who had seen the machine up close and returned not with theories, but scars. Judges hold lives in their hands, she said, voice steady, gaze locked on the panel of senators before her. They can destroy reputations, dissolve families, and dictate freedom, all with the stroke of a pen. And yet they are subject to less scrutiny than school teachers or public bus drivers. She let the silence sit. We ask teachers to log every parent call. We monitor the steps of police officers with body cameras. We audit public health workers quarterly, but a federal judge can deny a man's right to a fair trial and never explain why, and no one asks. The chamber was still, the weight of her words undeniable. She moved forward, flipping open a binder filled with decades of judicial misconduct cases dismissed in silence. 73% of complaints are internally reviewed and quietly closed. Not with discipline, not with transparency, but with bureaucratic shrugs hidden behind Latin phrases and black robes. Her fingers tapped the table once. That's not oversight. That's ritualized immunity. The senators shifted in their seats, some looking down, others visibly unnerved. And then came the solution, not abstract, not hopeful, but specific. We need an independent judicial review commission, she said, her tone crisp. A civilian-led body with investigative authority, access to sealed records, subpoena power, and the legal obligation to publish findings. No more internal reviews by friends. No more secret warnings behind chamber doors. She laid out the framework like a blueprint for systemic transformation. Members would be chosen by bipartisan appointment. Judges under review would be prohibited from sitting until cleared. Annual transparency reports would be mandatory, and every citizen would have the right to file a grievance and receive a public response. We built mechanisms to oversee our military, our intelligence community, our police, she continued. We gave the public a window into their conduct because we understood power without transparency is not just dangerous, it's corrosive. But we left the judiciary untouched, as if the robe itself was a shield against wrongdoing. Then came the line that would be etched into the congressional record and replayed on every news outlet that night. Justice that cannot be questioned is not justice. It is authority in disguise, and authority without accountability is tyranny, no matter how polished the courtroom floor. The room remained quiet after she finished, not out of indifference, but because no one knew how to follow it. No one could. Because in that moment, every person present, legislator, staffer, citizen, felt the same chill run down their spine. They had spent decades defending the structure, but now for the first time, they were being forced to ask who it had truly been built to protect, and they didn't like the answer. The story of Jasmine Crockett is not simply the tale of a courtroom turned battlefield. It is a visceral, pounding reminder that justice is not a monument we admire from afar. It is a living, breathing force that demands constant protection and constant confrontation. Jasmine didn't enter that courtroom seeking glory. She walked in knowing the cost of standing up against a system designed to absorb resistance and punish those who expose its cracks. She faced a judge who weaponized procedure like a shield, cloaked in arrogance, wielding tradition as a sword. She stood toe-to-toe with institutional rot and didn't flinch. That's the power of principle. It does not scream, it endures. And when the full weight of corruption tried to crush her, she didn't crumble. She countered with facts, with law, and most importantly, with unshakable integrity. But her fight wasn't just about exposing one man. It was about forcing a nation to reckon with its complacency. It was about the uncomfortable truth that injustice doesn't always wear a villain's face. It often smiles behind a bench, speaks in measured tones, and wears the robe of legitimacy. Jasmine's triumph teaches us that justice isn't about reverence. It's about resistance. It isn't guaranteed by design. It's upheld through defiance. And that silence in the face of abuse, whether from fear, habit, or misplaced trust, is the soil where tyranny grows. Her stand reminds us of something we forget too easily. Truth isn't always welcome in rooms built to preserve comfort. Sometimes it walks in and rearranges the furniture. Sometimes it tears down the walls. Jasmine became that truth, not just for Sterling, not just for one trial, but for every unseen defendant, every buried voice, every person who sat in a courtroom knowing something was wrong and believing they were powerless to stop it. She rewrote that narrative with courage sharp as a blade. And in doing so, she didn't just restore faith in the law, she reignited belief in something more powerful. That one person, armed with truth and unshaken by fear, can challenge the system and win. Because justice isn't a building, it's a choice, one we must keep making, especially when it's hardest to choose. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.